All right, Dr. Chapin, we're gonna get started. Let me first just say welcome and thank you everyone for joining us. We've got quite a number of folks that have registered, and they may be joining us in the next couple of minutes. But I want to go ahead and get started. I'm particularly excited about this topic. It's one that I've actually seen twice. I've had Dr. Chapin speak to our advanced leadership program in Gainesville for county commissioners. And we asked him to repeat this at one of our conferences, and it was very well received. The title is Demographics or Destiny. And I think with the current census count that's going on, it's even more important. And here's why. Really, the key policy and funding decisions that counties and cities make are driven by the growth in population. And those are sort of the basic factors and standards that communities use, whether they're doing future land use allocations on their future land use map, how much residential property they need to allocate, how much commercial, how much industrial. It's all driven by population factors. Same thing for transportation, whether you're going to put in a 4 or 6 lane road in 10 to 20 years or do intersection improvements. Same thing for water facilities and sewer facilities, and the list goes on. So population and how you project that population is really a key factor in local community planning decisions. But I think one thing that, and this is my observation, that gets left out is kind of parsing that information. What does that population look like over time? Is the population aging? Are they getting younger? What's the household size composition? And that's key. I mean, if you've got a population demographic that is going to place less demands on your facilities, then you need to calculate that in at some point. So this topic is very fascinating. I think it's very important. And so I am very happy that Dr. Chapin has agreed to come and present this topic with us. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Chapin, he is the Dean of the College of Social Sciences at Florida State University. And within that college, they have a number of departments, economics, public policy, geography, urban planning, and then they have a number of research centers and institutes that are very good. Before that, he was the chair of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning within the college, and I'm a proud alumnus of that, so I'm very happy to have him come and be able to present for us. So he is an expert in the areas of growth management, transportation, and more importantly for today's topic on demographics. And so with that, Dr. Chapin, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to minimize my screen to sort of save some bandwidth. Anyone that has questions, please put them in either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end to have Dr. Chapin answer those. So Dr. Chapin, thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to this.
Real pleasure to be here, Eric. Thank you for the invitation. Hopefully you can hear me, and we're going to have a talk that's full of pictures and charts and images. I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and I want you to note that my email's up there on the screen. If there's anything in here that you see that you want more information on, you can email me and I'll do my best I can to help you. Again, I've got a lot of slides and I'm going to be covering some ground on this idea of demographics as destiny. We live in a remarkably uncertain world right now, remarkably uncertain world. In that, we're living in this COVID environment. There's a lot of worry about the economics of Florida and around the globe. But what I can tell you is that what demographics do offer is a bit of certainty for understanding our people and our community. So that's what I want to talk about today, is some of the knowns in a very uncertain world. So I'm going to be talking about a few key themes today. The big point essentially is that there are lots of massive demographic changes that are happening in Florida and around the United States. And I am going to focus on Florida and the US today. That should grab your attention as elected officials, as policymakers, if you're a planner or a community official or a public servant or out in the private sector. Demographic trends are powerful and they're ongoing. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our growth trajectory. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the silver tsunami, AKA the gray wave, AKA the fact that we as a nation are getting older, and I'll show you some data on that. I'm going to talk about the browning of Florida, and that's language that demographers use, which means that we're becoming much more diverse with our communities of color and populations of color. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about household size changes and mix changes in household types. The overriding point essentially is that these trends are pervasive, they are powerful, and they are in many ways inevitable. There's not much that we can do to short circuit these changes. We need to sort of surf the reality of the fact that we are growing, we're getting older as a population, we're continuing to diversify, and our household mix is changing. So again, lots of slides. So I'm going to move relatively quickly through some of them, but we'll have time for Q&A at the end. First of all, we're growing as a nation, and that's not, and we're growing faster than a lot of other nations around the globe. Not as fast as nations like China and India and some of the developing world, but as modern developed nations go, the U.S. Is growing pretty quickly. I actually grabbed this screenshot from a census population clock that they have, and the nation is adding a new resident every 16 seconds. Right now. What's interesting about this is about a year ago, we were adding a new resident about every 12 seconds, if I recall correctly. But because of international immigration slowing way down, our growth is slowed, but we're still growing pretty quickly. By 2050 or so, the nation's expected to grow from about 330 million to 400 million. This is a big stepping stone. We tend to like big round numbers. What's interesting is that we need to recognize that in 2010, the population for the nation was about 308 million. We're going to add about 90 million residents between 2010 and about 2050. But much of that growth is due to international migration. The U.S. as a whole is growing much more quickly than Germany, Japan, Italy, France, lots of other developed countries, because we tend to have higher, I'll say it this way, rates of reproductivity. We have larger families, we have more kids. But a very substantial part of the nation's growth is in international migration. And that is one area in which there is some fluctuation in terms of policy, because as there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years, international immigration is something that the nation controls. So I'm not going to get into all that. But the U.S. is growing. What's interesting, and I think which is well understood, is this growth is not equal across the country. This shows growth in the last decade, 2000 to 2010, by county for the United States as a whole. The greens are growing, the purples, if that's what you're seeing on your screen, or pinks, are in decline. And essentially what you see is that we've got growth in the Sun Belts, we've got growth on the coasts, but the Midwest is actually depopulating. They're not growing, as is much of the upper Midwest. And there are real changes in population flows across the nation. And this just sort of hints at that. And these trends have been ongoing for a few decades. And I suspect when we get the 2020 data, the map for the most recent decade will look a fair bit like this. Excuse me. In terms of Florida, the state of Florida has grown, excuse me, about 3 million people a decade for every single decade from about 1950. And I suspect that's about where we'll end up as of the official 2020 census count for the state of Florida. 3 million people a decade, decade after decade. It's a remarkable thing. We wouldn't recognize Florida were we to travel back 100 years ago, and there were only about 700, 800, 900,000 people in a state that now is over 21 million. As we look ahead to Florida's growth, this is the most recent data out of the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, headed by the remarkable Amy Baker over at EDR. This is one of her slides. This is the latest projection as of January. I suspect they're going to need to revise these numbers once we're a little bit further along into the COVID world that we're living in. But essentially, our growth is expected to slow down a little bit. So we're going to only, quote unquote, be adding between 2.5 and 2.75 million people for the next decade or two. But that's still a lot of growth compared to a lot of states. So the Florida growth machine is in fact humming again. Having said that, there are some longer term demographic challenges that the state is facing. One of the key ones, if you look at that pink line at the bottom, one of the key ways that populations change, or actually populations grow or decline based on two major forces. Number one is natural increase or decrease. You have natural increase when you have more births than deaths. And then you can also have in a population migration, net migration positive which we have in Florida, more people moving to Florida than are moving out of Florida. As best we can tell, the demographic trends are pretty powerful in that in a handful of years, and in about a decade, we're actually, as a state, going to experience more deaths in the state than births in the state. We're going to actually have a net natural decrease in our population because of those trends. We're still going to grow as a state because we anticipate very strong continued net migration from other states and from around the world. But there's some interesting demographic trends in Florida that bear watching moving forward. That's topic one, so growth. The nation's growing, Florida's growing, Florida will continue to grow, but our mix of growth is changing, and that we will be growing more due to migration than to more babies than people dying in our populations. That's theme one. Second topic is the graying of America, the silver tsunami, the gray wave. What I want to talk a little about here is the growth in our senior populations. The traditional measure we've used is people aged 65 and older. The language of a few decades ago is we talked about elderly populations, 65 and older. Now we talk about older adult populations, 65 and older. And the big story here is that the nation as a whole is getting much older quickly because of our aging of our baby boom population. Lots of those baby boomers are aging into those older adult or have aged into those older adult populations of 65 and older. Florida is one of the oldest states in the nation, but the entire nation is going to expect growth in their 65 plus population and has over the last decade. If we look at the age 65 plus by county in Florida, in 2010. This is some data produced by the folks down at Beaver at the University of Florida, good colleagues down there. The darker the color, the higher the percentage of population age 65 and older. And it shows you that for much of the state, many counties in the state, they have at least 22%, sort of the darkest brown, and the next lighter shade of brown are the 22% and over. That's in 2010. The big story is that when we fast forward to 2030 and look at our county level populations, and we're using the exact same categories here, you should see much, much darker counties across the state. And what this means is that most of our counties will have a much larger percentage of their population age 65 and older. This is an inevitability. This is a wonderful thing, by the way, older populations, but it's a reality for the state, and it's a reality not just for Florida, but around the country. So the age of a population matters, and Eric mentioned that early on, is that different age profiles have different service needs from the public sector and the private sector for that matter. So what I want to do now is use one of my favorite tools to talk a little bit about the age of our communities around the state. I'm going to use what are called population pyramids. And for those of you that have seen me to give this talk before, you're going to see probably some of the same graphics. But essentially what a population pyramid does is it allows you to visualize at a point in time the age, sex distribution of the population. It's called a population pyramid because of, if you look on this chart here in front of you, in the US in the year 1900, you can see on the left there is the population pyramid. The males are in green, the females are in sort of that orangish yellow, depending on what your screen color is. The males are on the left, the females are on the right, and then the age cohorts go from the youngest, the 0 to almost 5-year-olds in that bottom age cohort, up to the very oldest age cohorts, 85 and plus. That 1900 population pyramid illustrates why demographers call it a population pyramid. You will see, though, that the US population pyramid has changed over time. By 1950, it looked a little bit more like almost a Central American Incan sculpture almost. And by the year 2000, it looks more like a modern piece of art rather than a pyramid, in fact. If you look at that 2000 population pyramid, what you'll see is that there's a much fatter top, meaning that a larger percentage of our population is aged in those older cohorts, and a much thinner bottom in the year 2000. So that's for the US as a whole. I'm now going to show you a few Florida population pyramids and then a few county population pyramids for the state. This is Florida's population pyramid in 1970. And the way I have described this in talks I give is this is the state at its very young age of about 50 years ago. It looks to me like a rocket ship ready to take off. We're in the midst of our space age in the state of Florida, and I've highlighted for you that those baby boomers, that bulge in the population in the bottom, that fuel to the rocket that's about to take off, is the baby boom generation. So there's a big fat set of baby boomers, and I don't mean to say they're individually fat, but there are many of them. They're a bulge in our population. If we zoom ahead and let the rocket take off, and we move ahead 40 years, we see now a much more top-heavy population pyramid for the state of Florida. I've again highlighted those baby boomers. They've aged 40 years. And if you're older than 40 years then you too have aged 40 years in that time period. Again, demographics as destiny, as inevitability. And you can see that the state's demographic profile is very, very different in the year 2010. And then if I were to zoom ahead 10 years to where we are now, once we get the final census data, you'll see that those baby boomers are even more towards the top of the population pyramid. So just to show you that the demographic age makeup of the state, this is about where we are right now. Let me now zoom around the state and just show you some different population pyramids. And again, the story here is that this is a really nice way of visualizing what your community looks like versus the state of Florida versus the nation as a whole. This is Hillsborough County, Tampa. And the Hillsborough population pyramid, frankly put, looks very much like the US population pyramid as a whole. It's large, it's urban, it's relatively diverse. It's got age balance, it's got gender balance. So this is a typical urban or large suburban county in Florida and around the country. They look a lot like this, I'd say. When we go to rural counties, on the other hand, we see a very, very different looking population pyramid. Now, this is Putnam County. A rural county tends to have, I always think of it as a shark bite out of the middle on both sides of the population pyramid. What we see in a lot of rural counties is that children grow up and then they leave to either go get education, they go seek opportunity, they go seek lifestyle, and they leave to go to other places to work. There's a lot of young adult flight. What happens in rural counties is we end up with, and this is the language that demographers use, we have left behinds. We have older adults that have chosen to remain in their rural county, and we have those kids that are not yet old enough to have left and gone elsewhere in the county. So again, rural counties look very different than our urban and large suburban counties. We also have a fair number of counties in the state, this is Lafayette County, that have large prisons in them. Prisons and economic development go together in rural counties in Florida and around the country, to be fair. But what you see here is a population pyramid that at first looks very strange. Again, just to remind you, on the left-hand side is that male population. There's a large male prison in Lafayette County, and that skews the population pyramid when we're looking at the total population, or the pyramid for the total population there. So just to show you that there's some oftentimes very interesting stories in these counties. I'm now going to zoom to my home county, Leon County, the home of Florida State University, FAMU, TCC, three large institutions of higher education. There are two counties in the state of Florida that look a lot like this, Leon County and then Alachua County, where the University of Florida is. We have this very, very huge influx of young people every year. Even this year, we'll have some coming back to FSU, and it makes the population pyramid look very distinct. And what's interesting about that very large bulge in the 15 to 29-year-olds is that bulge is always there. They don't age out because they come to school, they're here for 4 years, 6 years, whatever it might be, and then they leave and they go elsewhere to work, to live, and so on and so forth. So college towns, this is a very common look. We're now going to get into sort of what we oftentimes think about Florida. This is Collier County down on the southwest coast, a very strong base. It's top heavy, it's retirement leaning. You'll notice it's much fatter at the top than even the state of Florida. And by that, I mean it has a much larger percentage of residents that are age 65 and older. So this is retirement leaning. I'm now going to show you what I call, and many of us know of, we call the villages, and I also call it hyper retirement land. This is Sumter County, which is the home of the largest pieces of the villages retirement community. Talk about a very different demographic profile than Leon County or Alachua County. A very different look. These individuals have very different service needs. I'd note that Sumter County also has a prison, which is why there's that little bit of a left-hand lean or the bulge on the male population. But you'll notice this almost looks like a spinning top in its look. And again, these are the demographics of Sumter County that they enjoy, but a very different demographic profile. And then the last county I'm going to show you is Sarasota County. The reason I call attention to Sarasota County is this is a lot what Florida is going to look like in about 10 years, in 2030. Retirement land, AKA Florida's future. A very, very, very expansive top, held together or supported by working age populations, young people, and families. But this is where Florida is headed. So just to show you that your demographics matter, your age profile matters. In terms of Florida's population pyramid, when I took this for the state as a whole, I left this at 2010. I'll now then sort of zoom ahead to the 2030 projected population pyramid. There are those baby boomers, and there's where something like what Sarasota is right now. Florida is aging as a state, as is every state. And we've got a lot of these older adults that have chosen to retire to Florida or continue to work in Florida. They're wonderful residents, but it's part of our demographic reality. Now, what's interesting is Florida is in many ways the future of the nation. Where we are right now is where the US as a whole is headed. And that's because the largest amount of growth in the population as we look at future projections in terms of our age cohorts is in older age cohorts. I've got on this slide, the future is silver. By that I mean our oldest age cohorts account for over 50% of our population growth as a state between 2010 and 2030. This is an inevitability. This is wrapped up in our wonderful baby boom generation, and it's a big part of what this future of Florida looks like, but also the future of just about every county and every community in Florida will look like. They will see growth in their older adult populations as well. So that was theme 2. The future is silver, the gray wave, the aging of our population and the baby boomers. Let me now spin to the third topic I wanted to talk about. This is an interesting issue for a cover of an issue of Time magazine. This is from 1993, talking about the new face of America, how immigrants are shaping the world's first multicultural society. Here we are 27 years later, and we're still wrapped up in this idea of a new face of America and what we're going to look like demographically, ethnically, racially. We're in a particularly, I will say, tough, but also to my mind, propulsive moment in the nation's history with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that maybe we're actually going to see a great leap forward in race relations. It's not comfortable, it's not easy. That's wrapped up in this issue and also the ongoing concerns that some people have about the demographics of the nation. Let's talk demographics. Simply put, the US is on a trend in which the browning of America will move forward, and by sometime in the 2040 decade, we will become a majority minority nation. And by that, I mean there will be more non-whites in the population of the United States than there will be whites. By non-white, we mean Hispanic, we mean Black, we mean Asian, we mean American Indian, and other racial and ethnic groups that are not deemed white in the way we count populations. And I'm not going to get into that as a topic, but when we count and categorize people, we are trending towards being a majority minority nation sometime in the decade of the 2040 to 2050, somewhere in there. What's interesting is this is a national trend, but it also is being experienced across states. I actually dug this data up today. I'd not seen this article. I will tell you that if you're looking for one person in the world who really gets the demographic trends in the United States, it's a gentleman by the name of William Frey, who's a demographer. He is the rock star, the most awesome. He's the LeBron James, Michael Jordan of demographers, if you will. He's got this book, Diversity Explosion. I've got the cover there for you. And he's got a new little study in which he looked at how states are going to be browning between 2015 and 2030. On the left, you can see where we were as of 2015, minority percentage shares as of state populations. Again, the darker the color, the larger the share of the population that was minority. As we look at 2030, you can see that as a whole, the nation gets a lot more diverse. We're going to have much greater populations of minority populations in every state. So just as we're getting older because of the baby boomers, we're also getting browner because of the growth in those populations. Now, what's driving this? Why is it that this browning of America is inevitable? Well, again, this is where demographics are pretty powerful. This is another really great chart that William Frey put together in some of his work. This is race ethnic profiles by age group in the United States in the year 2010. In the very bottom age group, the 85 and plus, 85 and up group, 85% of our 85 and older population was white, or as of 2010. But as you go through each successively younger age cohort, you'll notice that the mix is getting more and more diverse. And in fact, by 2010, when you get to that under 5-year-old cohort, it's roughly equal between whites and non-whites. So this is a demographic trend. Blacks have have larger families and higher rates of reproduction than whites. Hispanics in particular are have much greater rates of reproduction in their households than non-Hispanics, although they are slowly coming down over time. The point is essentially that we are seeing more and more young children of color being born in this country or moving into this country. The year 2011 was a very important one in the nation's history. For the first time in the nation's history, there were more non-white babies born in the United States than white babies born in the United States in the year 2011. This is a demographic trend. It's not likely to change. It is a demographic destiny for the nation. And again, from my view, this is a wonderful thing. What does this mean for the state of Florida? Well, again, really neat work by Dr. Frey and his work. States that tip from to minority between 2015 and 2030. Florida is one of those. As of 2015, the state was about 44% minority. He predicts that by 2030 will be above 50%, along with Alaska, New Jersey, Georgia, and the other states you can see on this list. And that will join some states that have already made that or reached that milestone. So demographics as destiny. What does this mean also for Florida? Well, a very good example is in our Hispanic population in the state. This is again using data from the University of Florida in 2010. This is the percent of the population in each county that's Hispanic. Again, you'll notice that we see a traditional pattern that we have in our heads that our Hispanic population is in sort of the central spine of the peninsula and then down in South Florida. But when we zoom ahead to 2030, we see that the Hispanic population percentages are growing in most counties, and much of the peninsula will see substantial growth in their Hispanic populations. Why is that? Well, it's because very simply, the Hispanic population is much younger than the non-Hispanic population in the state. So what I've got on this slide is a comparison of the non-Hispanic population, a population pyramid for that, for the state on the left, and the Hispanic population on the right for the state of Florida. And you can see very substantial differences between our non-Hispanic and our Hispanic population. The Hispanic population is younger. Younger populations are the ones, by the way, that tend to make and produce the babies. It's not the older cohorts for the most part. We know those demographic and biological facts. So it's important to understand that there are differences in the makeup of our Hispanic population and non-Hispanic population. What's interesting is this is Florida's difference between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. When we look at the nation as a whole, you'll see a very, very even more powerful thing. This is the United States non-Hispanic population pyramid on the left, and the U.S. Hispanic population pyramid on the right. And if that's not a demographic force, I'm not sure what is. Very, very substantial differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanics for the nation as a whole. The Hispanic portion of the population is one of the fastest growing groups that we've got in the nation, and it's in part because they're much younger as a set of households than other racial and ethnic groups in the nation. So that's just to give you a sense of what's going on nationally. For the state of Florida as a whole, again, one of the great joys of, I've been in Florida now 21 years, is I love the diversity of our state. We're one of the most diverse states in the nation. Our percent Black, our percent Hispanic, our percent foreign born, and our percent English not spoken at home percentages put us among the very top states in the nation. And this is 2010 data. I suspect the 2020 data will show increases in all of those, and also probably ranks that are very similar. So we're a very diverse state, and that's one of the great joys of working in Florida, although occasionally a challenge for some of the household challenges that come with that. So that's topic 3, the browning of America. I'm now going to end on what I call an American and Floridian tiny house revolution. And this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek slide. For those of you that know what a real tiny house is, it's sort of a very small, a few hundred square feet house for people that want to live in a cabin in the woods or something like that. I really don't mean a true tiny house revolution, but what I do mean is that our household sizes are getting smaller. And in fact, there's some evidence that our housing units are going to need to get smaller as a result. So let's talk the demographics. I suspect many of you, if you're even something of an age of me, will remember the Leave It to Beaver television show from many, many decades ago about the Beaver family, the parents and the 2 boys, including the eponymous name of the show, Beaver himself. The big story here is that we oftentimes have this image in America that we are a bastion of single family homes with mom and dad and a set of kids that live there. And the reality is that in 1960, that might have been true when roughly half of all households had children in the household. But as of 2025, it's closer to about 1 in 4 households will have children in the household. We've made a big demographic shift and a social shift in our household formation and makeup. What's driving this in part is, on this slide, you'll see at the bottom, single person households. We've seen a big rise in people choosing to live alone or ending up living alone. We are anticipated to have as many households with only 1 resident in the entirety of the households as we do households with children in them. So we were a very different nation back then, demographically and in terms of our household mix. What's going on? Well, part of that is the decline in the married household. If we look back in 1970, we look at the mix of households, we saw a very large percentage of households were married couple households. When we zoom ahead to 2010 and we look at household data, it's actually now only about half of all households are married couples with other people in them. And you can see the rise of other household types, 1-person households or multi-person households. What this has led to is a decline in the average household size, and this is not just a US thing. In fact, this is a global phenomenon in the developed world. So as we look at US versus, let's say, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK, granted a selected set of countries here, but this is not a uniquely US thing. If we look at the household sizes in the United States versus these countries, we can see that they've all come down substantially. Nationally, the average household size, I believe, is a little just over 2.5 in people per household. In Florida, it's lower than that. I want to say it's about 2.35 or something like that. I should have looked this morning and I forgot to do that. But you get the idea. Household sizes are shrinking over time. A very interesting phenomenon. It's what's been called the Singleton Revolution. If you're looking for a really sort of clever and fun book about a demographic trend that's particularly taking root in cities, Eric Kleinenberg wrote a book called Going Solo, in which he writes about the rise of choice singles, people who choose to live alone. And I don't mean just as young people or as older people, but for the entirety of their life. It talks about young singles, widows, widowers, divorced singles, and so on. So there's been a big rise in the Singleton household. So there's demographic trends wrapped up in our household size. I'm going to skip that slide and I'm going to sort of hit the high points here and then see what questions we've got and what is on everybody's mind. So let me just hit the high points of the ground I've covered today. Number one, demographics are destiny. There are many ongoing, intertwined, inevitable demographic trends that are reshaping the nation, reshaping the states, and will likely reshape the communities that you work in and that you lead. We have the blessing as a nation and as a state of continuing to grow. That's sometimes a burden, but I'd rather be a growing state than a declining state. People are, as Eric talked about in his intro, they do need water, they need schools and so on, but they tend to be additive. I'd much rather be growing than declining, and we're blessed to have growth going on here in Florida that will continue. There is indeed a remarkably powerful silver tsunami going on in the nation and in Florida. And what's going to happen is by about 2025, 1 in 4 of the entire state is going to be 65 and older. That's a pretty remarkable number when you think about it, where we were 100 years ago when it comes to the nation's population pyramid. So our silver tsunami. We're continuing to diversify as a nation. I've talked a lot about the browning of America here today, the browning of Florida, but we're diversifying in many other ways. And I think that's a wonderful thing, but it occasionally brings complex households, cultural differences in cultural settings, and language issues, particularly here in the state where we have about a quarter of our households don't speak English at home. And that's a wonderful thing, but sometimes a challenge to provide services in those households. I've talked about the growth in non-children households and singles households. To my mind, a lot of the development industry, the folks that are poised for longer term success, understand the demographics of the households they're serving. We're not 1960 when 1 in every 2 households were a married man and woman with some kids. That household type has gone way down. And last but not least, and this is a topic for another day, and frankly, the stuff that I'm most interested in, and Eric hinted at in his opening, and that is that we're going to continue to grow. These demographic trends are embedded where people choose to live, and how we create communities and development for them is going to be the next defining issue of the next generation, from my view. How we balance conservation and development is going to impact our economy, our environment. It's either going to yield greater equity or less equity moving forward. And the last slide I've got, and then I'll turn it back to Eric to lead us through the Q&A, is just I'm a big believer in pointing you to some good resources. And here are some of my favorite books on the broad topic of demographics and development and what's going on in the United States. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm guessing we've got some questions.
We do. And let me go ahead and just take those in order. We got about 5 or 6. The first one says, with fewer people being married, will this affect household incomes and who goes on welfare in a state or in the United States as a whole?
Short answer is yes. Household formation and the number of people in the household, there are income effects. So if you have a two income household, there's more income for the household. Single income households are more at risk, because if you have 2 wage winners and one of them is laid off in the midst of a global pandemic, but somebody is still earning income in the household, that's a good thing. So there are real concerns. Sociologists have investigated and looked at this, and there's a real interesting, I'll briefly say, a big mixed opinion on single occupant households are really great when your health is good and when you have a job, but they can yield problems when your health isn't good and when the economy turns down. So there's sort of social and emotional positive effects, but there are economic concerns there. So that's a reasonable concern. Again, though, the demographic trend is clear. We're seeing more and more of these singleton households.
Good, thank you. The next question is, given the U.S. is much richer now than in the post-World War II period, what can be done to restore an increase in the number of families with children in the future?
You know, the issue, I think there's sort of embedded in there is there a way to, are there policy approaches, or are there ways to encourage people to have more kids or to have larger households? This is a long run trend in society, in that the better off we get, the fewer kids we have. And that's in part because the economy has changed. We go back 100 to 150 years, we oftentimes had lots of kids because we needed them to work on the homestead, essentially. Now, for many of us, we don't need them to go work the fields. We don't need them to do labor around the house. Kids are remarkable, but they're expensive. I'll observe I have two, and I love them dearly, but you don't get rich through having kids. I think there have been some experiments globally in trying to encourage households to affect their household sizes. In France and in Germany and in Italy, those are countries that are desperately trying to get their households to have more kids. There are actually financial incentives. There are free schooling and things like that. I don't know that in our country, we've talked about that, and I wonder if in our society we'd be willing to do that. But that's a very fraught question. Can we use either financial or other incentives to get people to ratchet up the reproduction within the family? And I don't have a good answer to that one.
Thank you. Next question is, if you can, please address the question of impact of migration changes associated from climate change. Example, in Florida, from coastal counties to inland counties, nationally from coastal areas and states to more inland areas and states, including impact on migration in Florida.
You know, fascinating question. We've got a faculty member in my college, Matt Hauer, who's a sociologist, a demographer, who's actually building models. He's got a global model right now looking at climate change, sea level rise to induce migration. And he's now, from what I understand, working on one for the US as a whole. This is a long run challenge. We don't have a really good grasp on it yet. Again, I'm a planner first and foremost, and I pretend to be a demographer. This is a long run issue for much of the state and our coastal areas. We don't have a good, real good understanding of what that's going to be yet, in part because it's just far enough out there in the future for a lot of people as of right now to worry much about it. But as seas rise, as property goes underwater, as infrastructure gets abandoned because of that, there will be migration. And the long run for the state of Florida is very different in terms of its growth than the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Thank you. And the next question is one that I actually was thinking about. It says, any insights on how the pandemic will affect the demographic trends that you spoke about? We could be looking at generational impacts on personal income, GDP, education, crime, et cetera.
I'm going to offer hypotheses, but there's no really good data on this. So what we see is during the midst of massive economic events, there are some demographic things that happen. Number one is oftentimes we see mortality go up, and we're seeing that with COVID, as you'd expect. It's a global health pandemic, but you can also see that because of COVID, people aren't getting cancer screenings. People aren't going to the hospital to check on things. So there's sort of an expectation that we'll see a bump up in mortality rates that'll be discernible to some degree and probably long-lived. And by that, I mean for a handful of years here. The other thing we see demographically is people delay making more kids. There's literally data out there that show that, and I don't mean to be indelicate, but people are having less sex because of the stress, but also people are delaying the choice of adding kids to the household because of the economic fear. So that there's the real issue that we'll see fewer, they're anticipating a baby bust in what were already relatively low fertility rates in the population. On the household size, when we have economic tough times, what happens is people actually get out of those single occupant households. So we anticipate more people choosing to live with others to keep their costs down because that's what they can afford. It'll be interesting in a few years to see if there's a discernible uptick in household size because of COVID and what it means for sort of the income of people over the next few years. But young people don't move out of mom and dad's house, for example. They stay there until they're sure they can go rent a place successfully. If you're out of work, you may move back in with family or friends. So there's some household size impacts that are expected as well. As to how long they last, the best we've got is the longer the pandemic affects the economy and the uncertainty of all of our decision making, the longer each of those trends will be. Higher mortality, less fertility, likelihood of people moving in together. The other thing that's also happening is there is a boom in homelessness that is anticipated. So we'll have more and more people living not in a housing unit, but under a bridge somewhere or somewhere in the community, and that's not a good thing at all.
Thank you. And I'm just taking the questions as they come in order, so I know people might get a little impatient. The next question is, have we hit the bottom of household size? Will the curve flatten now and over the next 10 years?
It's been flattening for the last decade, 15, 20 years. It sort of saw a big fall off in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. But over the last decade or two, it really has it looks like it's bottomed out. And as I say, I wouldn't be surprised if in the near term, we see actually a tick up a little bit in the national household size and in the state household size because of the economic uncertainty. But whoever asked the question, I think if they must know a little something about the data, but it looks like it has bottomed out, that we haven't seen the drop off that we've seen in the previous decades.
Okay, two more questions. It says, with the pandemic, we've learned that many parents prefer homeschooling or virtual learning over in-class learning. How might this affect households and your view of housing's getting smaller?
Boy, that's let me observe, first of all, demographers tend to look at long-run trends, and COVID has the possibility to be a long-run event, or it has the possibility to be a few-year blip in long-run trends. And I don't know quite where we're going to end up. I do hear a lot, and this is all anecdotal data. I hear from people that I know professionally that wish they had a bigger household so that they could escape the kids to a quiet spot to do their Zoom calls and things like that in the midst of this. If we move to a much more remote work world, you could imagine a scenario in which people look for households or housing units, excuse me, that have an extra bedroom or a distinct office space for people to work in, which might turn the household size, the housing unit size trend around a little bit. There's a lot of conjecture there. We don't have really good data on this. And again, part of it is, is this the new reality, remote work? Or is this a blip in, and by a blip, I mean that in 5 years, we'll remember this time without much joy, but things are back to a pre-pandemic sort of normal. And I just don't know.
Okay. Next question is, and we're still within our time frame here. It's an interesting, I had to read it a couple of times, but it says nutrient in education is a STEM form of educational learning. How does this relate to the need of more services for older adults and service-oriented jobs? I think maybe going into the future, you got more people in a high profession and maybe less available in the service industry.
We're seeing, Florida is truly a global leader in this, and that we have a lot of our older adults that work because they need to for financial reasons, or work because they've retired here and they're bored and they want to be engaged and working. So Florida is actually, as a state, pretty good at this. We've got a higher percentage of workforce participation than a lot of other states, from what I understand. There are, of course, important considerations that factor into people's ability to work, their desire to work. Does the work environment allow them, as we all age physically, our physical capabilities change? That's just a fact of life. The arms don't go above the head as easy. You can't stay on your feet as long, that type of thing. So does the work environment adapt to the changing workforce is a real issue. I'm going to piggyback on that question and just say there is a concern about what the future of the Florida and national workforce looks like. We're much better off than Germany, France, Japan, and other developed countries, where they have a real dearth of working age people looking ahead. But this is a real concern moving forward in Florida, and that we'll have lots and lots of older adults, and many of them will not at a certain point in their life be able to work. And how do we provide services for them? Do we have enough employees to fill in moving forward? That's a real concern, and something that I know demographers and economic development folks talk about.
We're showing this question answered, but it may not have been. And I know you skipped a slide 40 in the slide deck, but the question was, can you talk more about what you see coming in the diversity of housing options? I think that if you could answer that question within the context of really the theme of your presentation, which is, an aging population, what type of housing needs they might need, versus a community that has a much younger population, and really how does a community kind of incorporate those factors when it's doing comprehensive planning and land use allocation and that sort of stuff.
Right, right. So Eric, I'm going to zoom back to slide 40. Is it still up on the screen for everyone to see?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is what I'm going to talk. I'm a land use planner first and foremost, and I actually see demographics and land use and land development as there's a great positive potential here. With the household size mix changing, the household type changing, more and more singleton households, older adults, there are actually some really neat opportunities for what people call, and I call, quality growth. Smaller or more greater density with smaller units. People do want better accessibility to the places they want to go. I'll mention that my parents are both in their low 80s. There's a time in the not too distant future when they're going to need to probably have a conversation with them about them not driving anymore. And therefore they're going to need transit accessibility, or they're going to need to be able to get around to the grocery store or other places as they need. But I do think that there's a demographic connection to our land patterns. And I think there is an opportunity for more multifamily housing, more walk-ups. And we are actually seeing this nationally, although it's cooled off a bit now. There was a very, very substantial boom in multifamily housing around the country in the last decade or so, because people couldn't afford or didn't want the 4,000 square foot home on the 3 acres out somewhere. There's still demand for that property, but there's also substantial demand for more urban settings and a different type of housing mix that we've traditionally built. There's a book that I show in that last slide by Arthur Nelson, who I studied under at Georgia Tech. And one of his talking points is, we've got plenty of suburbs. What we need now is the good urban development that is underbuilt in a lot of our metro markets, or node-based or much more dense development in suburban areas that have townhouses, that have condos, that have walk-ups, that are also at different price levels. So I don't know if I answer the question, but I see a great opportunity for different types of housing moving forward than we've traditionally built, particularly in a very heavily suburbanized state like Florida.
Thank you. And the last question is from me. And are there communities that you're aware of that have done a good job at what you're talking about, that go beyond just the population projection, but parse the data, look at the population, the demographics and the composition, and then incorporate that either in their zoning code or land use code, where they, tell developers you're required to do smaller lot sizes because the demand is going to be there? Or is that really market driven?
Well, land development, we're still, we are in a deeply capitalistic country, and so it's very much market driven. But what I do find is that we've got around Florida, I'll just mention, we've got wonderful things called regional planning councils. We've got great groups like yours that help to educate public officials and local communities about some of the realities that they're facing. But I think of a group like the Planning Commission down there in Hillsborough County. I think of Metro Plan Orlando is another a good group in which they help to educate local governments, they help to educate private developers, they help to educate communities, because sometimes the problem isn't that sometimes developers want to build more dense, they want to build more mixed use, and then the people in the neighborhood show up with their torches and pitchforks and they insist that we don't want this type of development. So there's an ongoing journey in this. If you're looking for places that do it well, I think Sarasota City and Sarasota County have traditionally done a really good job in factoring in their demographic trends. I will tell you, it's sort of an odd one to think about, but the Villages and Sumter County as a community that understands their demographic challenges and opportunities, they do a really good job of ensuring that they meet the market that they're looking to meet down there. So there are lots of great planning organizations around the state. And I think that, APA Florida is a great set of folks to talk with, the American Planning Association, Florida chapter, your group, the Florida Association of Counties, what's the cities? Eric, what's your city counterpart?
We don't count them.
We don't speak of them. Okay, well, it's like UF and FSU apparently, so I'll just leave it there. But there are lots of great planning going on around the state. The main message, I guess, as we're bringing this to a close is, Your demographics matter. Your planners, your local public administrators, your county administrators, your city managers, they should understand this and know this, and then they can help educate you as you need. So I'll sort of stop there.
Great. That ends the questions. That ends the presentation. Dr. Chapin, thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for your partnership with us. This is a great topic. And again, I think because the census is going on, it's very important, very timely that we all pay attention to a lot of this. And since we kind of landed on housing, I just, for marketing purpose, next week, we're going to have Jamie Ross from the Florida Housing Coalition. She's going to speak about some of the affordable housing issues, kind of the ABCs, but she's also going to be presenting on some of the challenges that she sees as a result of the pandemic. So if anyone's interested in that, it'll be the same time, Wednesday at 2 o'clock. So everyone, thank you for joining us and taking an hour of your day on a Wednesday. We hope you enjoyed this, and we hope you will continue to participate in the others that we have going forward. Dr. Chapin, I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for participating today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.